Hello, kia ora. I'm Mel McCree from Free Range Creativity in Bath Spa, University, England. In this talk, I'm sharing some thoughts on my emergent feralosophy. It's a cultural perspective and a love letter to the feral. It's also a work in progress, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and your contributions to help inform it. So thanks in advance, and thanks to the conference conveners. First, I'm going to critique some understandings of the feral, then explore how else we might value it. From this, a feral standpoint is possible, an eco-social fusion. I give some examples of creative practice and identify some shared qualities. And finally, I've put some short provocations on my website, freerangecreativity.org, some fun, simple things to try. So how is feral commonly, or more truthfully, uncommonly understood? I say uncommonly as through a multi-species lens, we are 0.01% of life on Earth. My perspective from the minority world is even more uncommon. So from that starting point, let's look at some of the dominant discourse through the language we use. The domestic wild binary has historical roots in colonialism and minority world industrialised human culture. Here are some of the synonyms of the domestic. Civilized, controlled, tidy, cultivated, tamed, inhabited, regulated, restrained, homely, fertile, considered and practical. In contrast, many synonyms for the wild are simply antonyms of these words, such as uncivilized, uncontrolled, etc. There are few positive associations beyond wildly enthusiastic, free and madcap. This dualism demonstrates our well-rehearsed perception of humans as separate from the rest of nature. In my teaching, I often ask people to draw a diagram of their perception of their place in relationship to the natural or the wild. This diagram is a common response. Here we are in our place, and the wild is over there. We often perceive a boundary between us. The feral can be a connecting force, liberating us from the domestic to the wild. It is our escape from captivity. First, we need to culturally reconfigure the location of our place, which is not outside the wild. In reality, our place is located in the confines of wilder planet Earth. First, let's look at how the feral is usually valued. From a cultural perspective, the feral is viewed negatively, with no contribution to society, seen as a destructive, dark and scary element to be dismissed and not included. The feral animal is perceived as dangerous, dirty, disease-ridden, marked by irreversible neglect and out of place. The modern version of the feral child, begotten of feral parents, was recently used in UK discourse as a form of state regulation of parenting. Sarah de Benedictis gives a rigorous analysis of this discourse around the London riots of 2011, where people took to the streets and looted. The so-called feral parents, often working-class single mothers, were blamed publicly by the Prime Minister David Cameron and journalist Melanie Phillips. These so-called irresponsible parents had allowed their uncontrollable teenagers onto the streets to cause havoc. The judgment being made is that this segment of society contribute nothing to economic growth and are therefore not worthy of support or inclusion. They are unwanted and uneducated proletariat, poor out of their own making and deemed to be immoral, feckless outcasts. To add further contrast to the feral as unwanted, the wild has in turn been reified as something pure and exclusive. This is played out in commodified versions of wildness in parks, safaris and high-end tourism. The term wild has also been appropriated to mean simply some good, clean outdoors fun, a dumbing down. Nature red in tooth and claw is not present. Instead, this is Wild 2.0, as viewed safely in a packaged programme of adventure through our screens, aeroplane windows, at a distance. It bears little relation to reality, for the whole planet is now contaminated, impure, with levels of toxicity at micro levels permeating through elemental forces of air, water, earth, etc. So virginal wilderness is a myth. This distancing effect and tokenistic approach to the world is neither helpful nor truthful. The feral is perhaps more truthfully wild in its social position, in its danger, in its threat to our domesticity, and its embracing of a decay of the social order. We can value this honesty. Let's just for a moment imagine valuing the feral differently. For me, tramps are like the patron saints of the feral. Tramps are no longer romanticised in these times of increasing homeless people in our cities. Their lives are deeply precarious. Yet everyone is potentially the precariat in this age of ecological collapse, and the homeless and tramps are forerunners with valuable experience. How can we support them, and what could we learn from them? A feral standpoint champions those with the lowest aspirations for human impact. Within the argument for economic degrowth, it is logical that we find ways to be downwardly mobile. We could direct our knowledge practices towards making this a positive experience. Lewis, in 2015, states that feral disciplines can eat away at the uncomfortable foundations of problems with a call to embrace the decay of the old order, which will make available the conditions for the pluriverse to thrive, or the possibility for living relational worlds and ontologies which have been squeezed out of existence by neoliberal globalization's commitment to what Law calls a one-world world. Tramps survive outside of this ideological one-world world. So what have tramps encountered? What is life like at the edge? The edge effect, as defined in ecology and permaculture, gives us yet another perspective on the value of connecting the domestic and the wild. An edge here is the boundary or interface between two biological communities or landscape elements. The effect refers to the community changes happening at the boundary. As the edge effects increase, the boundary habitat allows for greater biodiversity. For me, the edge effect resonates with social movement theory and how innovation for change gets absorbed, changes the dominant discourse, and is changed by it. Mollison and Slay states that successful and permanent settlements have always been able to draw from the resources of at least two environments. A clear role then for the feral is in bringing new life and diverse ideas into our dominant culture habitats, to stray and transgress into other discourses with disruptive honesty. It is interesting that unique species can emerge in the edges, seen in this Venn diagram with 9 species in the edge part, rather than 6 on the outside. This reminds me of Haraway's speculative fiction on Odkin, where humans fuse with other species for their survival. So even if not biologically popular at present, relating more to other species allows us a sense of being in an ecosystem to infuse us and change us. The edge effect also reminds me of Anna Singh's unruly storying method. She calls it telling a polyphonic rush of troubled stories from the unruly edges. We can bring this thinking to a feral identification of ourselves within nature. Ecological degradation is a complex social problem, a messy eco-social fusion. We adapt and change through multi-species collaboration and assemblages. Singh states, "We are already contaminated by historical encounter. We are all an evolutionary mix and all mixed up in the projects that do us harm. Yet this contamination makes for diversity." A Feralosophy shares perspectives with object-oriented ontology, or OO, as a school of thought, rejecting the privileging of human existence over the more than human. It moves on from eco-philosophical or ecocentric positions to re-embrace the social. Catriona Sandilands critiques ecofeminists and deep ecological perspectives for being too essentialist in the idea that humans can return to an organic state of growth by transcending the ways in which nature has been constructed in patriarchal development. It is not modern life or artificial society that stifles our ecological self. These theories are in danger of reproducing an impossible dualism of nature/culture that they propose to stand against. The sociological theories of social selves, which to a large extent do take into account our biological or embodied self, as Goffman so prolifically does, state that we are both natural and social beings. Yet Sutton would make a key point that we tend to need to be shaken out of our social self as the primary reality to realise our innate biological self. Going feral could provide some of the shaking we need. Now let's look at some creative feral practice. I propose that they share qualities of honesty, hybridity, transgression and disruption. I'm going to give 4 examples. First, the Bristol Feral Choir. In the early noughties, the experimental jazz singer Phil Minton gave me his blessing to use his feral choir approach in my improvisation classes. To give feral voice is an emancipatory practice, liberating a voice from its usual confines. The voice is full of howling, yawning potential, and yet in everyday life we use a tiny percentage of its capabilities. In the choir, the feral quality of honesty is central, of accepting our voices in their raw states. Our voices exist at the centre of our beings as a conduit for the gamut of emotions, and to give voice is a proven elemental health-giving act, an inner rewilding process. The quality of hybridity is key in being open to others and changed by that process. The main principles the choir goes by is to listen, to do 10% and to copy. To improvise well, we need to be present to absorb deeply what is going on around us. To contribute well, we only need input 10% of the many great ideas we have, as the 90% of other space allows us to respond. Further, we can directly copy and amplify others. We worked with these principles over many years, and they remain essential to an enjoyable experience, whilst also constantly challenging to live by. They can be disruptive to the self, particularly the ego. They can sound distinctly antisocial, and certainly not like the public understanding of a choir. We learned, in essence, to be affected by our environment and to celebrate this. Going feral, then, was a natural expansion of the feral choir, moving out into wilder, more diverse living spaces to explore multi-species connections. We creatively explored a local woodland and inhabited our voices, bodies, season and place together. One participant called it the best fun you can have in the woods without taking your clothes off. We focused on disruption of sensory perception and thought in shaking ourselves out of our usual frames of mind. We explored tasks that challenge habitual perception, such as being snail-like or slow and moving in unfamiliar ways. We began to reperceive our environment in a fresh, embodied way. The slow challenges were the best part, in that we all benefited from the position to still the mind. What I love most about improvisation is it helps us to be present with others, to be open and to adapt in hybridity. This helps us figure out and inhabit group mind, a quality we need to collaborate. Lost in neoliberal culture, it is common to think that we have to give a unique individual contribution, and that paradoxically it is never good enough. We are fraught with anxiety. So it's liberating to be engaged in group improvisation, to enter into what Victor Turner calls communitas, joined in common bond, experiencing liminality together. We are relieved of the burden of doing it all by ourselves, and we contribute to and are transformed by a greater whole. Let's look at transgression, learnt through regular group improvisation, and how much of the more than human initiate coordinated movement, such as murmurations of starlings, flocks of geese, swarms of insects and schools of fish. Only one or very few of a group are needed to initiate and direct movement. Some recent research by Kruger et al. Into feral horses found that although herding was exclusive to alpha males, the most common movement of departure from the group could be initiated by any member with any group status. What I find interesting about this is that the more confident and skilled an improviser you are, the better and more trusted leader and follower you can be. Self-organisation and group adaptation are key competencies for collaborative survival. This feral quality of transgression, of stepping out, making a break for it, is in operation here, in this swooning exercise also. We're confident to lead as well as to follow. Now on to the Feral Spaces project, led by artist Laurel Gallagher, who works with disadvantaged urban communities in England to reclaim disused urban spaces as sites of immersive placemaking experience. She says dog walkers, graffiti artists, drug users and the homeless, each group recognises a value in this space. And it's clear from the start that disused urban spaces offer young people unique experiences, igniting their sense of adventure, creativity and freedom. Laurel and her team invite young people to explore and reimagine these spaces, providing the support they need. She says disused urban spaces hold a unique value for young people as places they can access for free, repurpose to their needs and build their own child-led communities. One technique used was to label things to share what they thought was important with others. Here we see where one young person found some bark, had an encounter, and wrote, "This piece of bark is huge. Do not gob. The name is Bob." He named it Bob the Bark. Clearly he's enjoying engaging empathically with the bark. Laurel said, "We left Bob on the path to encourage others to stop and think about their surroundings and everyday mundane nature." In this project, there is honesty in using the young people's everyday localities and in supporting them to take the lead. To visibly inhabit these spaces is a transgressive act, and the spaces themselves are the epitome of hybridity, edgelands where the urban and other species rub up against each other. On to feral trade. My last example, which is the artistic endeavour of Kate Rich. She's also given a paper in a conference in the Feral Education panel, so please do check it out. Feral trade originated with a cheap pun on fair trade, as Rich felt this often meant a glossed over version of business as usual. She wanted to get away from the romance of artisan trade into a more street wild, crossing boundaries and disrupting scalar metaphors of business. Her feral trade does not scale because it is willful. It cannot be a critical mass, categorised or inventorised. To Rich, scaling is colonial plantation thinking. Anna Singh also writes on non-scalability, saying that we need forms of scholarship that don't scale, rather we need ideas that proliferate. Diversity doesn't scale, it proliferates. The courier's journey imbue the products with individual biographies. Rich says the products are just an excuse for encounter, and plays with this collective collaborative chaos, the messy, self-organised and transitional. Here we have transgression and disruption, honesty in Rich's attempts to source the street wild without romance, hybridity too, in the changing of the practice through each encounter, and the product's multi-scalar journeys from source to table. So to summarise, in the critique of understandings and value of the feral, it is positioned negatively in mainstream industrial society within a dualistic discourse of nature and humans as separate. And what is a reconfigured value of the feral then, its place and function? It connects the wild and the domestic. It embraces degrowth. It works with what Africa Taylor calls the opportunistic, more than human, movers and shapers in multi-species relations. It disrupts business as usual with the exuberant proliferations of diverse life at the edges. And it is playful in making other worlds possible in a transgressive carnivalesque. It offers a means of pragmatic transition through eco-social fusions and messy collaboration. Finally, it takes an elemental view with the basic building blocks of life in the biological, geological, and a social focus on our sensory practices. So within the examples of practice, we've seen these values at play, along with feral qualities of honesty, hybridity, transgression and disruption. So do you think these qualities are accurate? And can you see others I've missed? So I'm interested to know whether you think there is a need for a feralosophical position or cultural approach, and whether these aims resonate with you, to redefine understandings and cultural values of the feral as a balancing transitional force for multi-species equity. 2. To demonstrate the role of feral culture change to transform our thinking and actions. And 3. To articulate how qualities of feral culture are necessary for our common survival. This talk is a starting point, seeking insight through transdisciplinary perspectives. I look forward to the panel debates and your questions. Thank you for your attention. For your information, I've added a full list of references and some links to relevant videos on my website, so do contact me with any ideas that can help this Feralosophy to grow. And I'll leave you with this quote by Anna Singh.